Gaining access phase. So here's the point where we're going to start gaining our foothold into the system. So we've done all of our research, we've done all of our enumeration and our scanning, and now it's the time to actually launch that attack. We're going to gain our access. So at this point in the attacker's methodology, we are going to exploit something in the operating system to be able to get ourselves into that. Whether that's going to be a client side, a remote side, or other type of attack, this is where we're going to do our exploitation. So step 3 is gaining access, and this is where we're going to perform our exploits for the first time in order to gain our access into the system. So we can do this through a client-side or remote exploitation attack. That's things like social engineering, open wireless connections, software bugs, unpatched systems, web application vulnerabilities, backdoors, buffer overflows, trojans. There's numerous ways to gain access, and it really doesn't matter which way we're going to use to gain access. The point is we're going to get our access into the system. Now, as we start going through this in our lab, what we're going to use is a simple buffer overflow type attack. We're also going to use in our lab some other types of things, such as the unpatched software. So if there's a system that hasn't been patched with the latest update, we can take that, use that to our advantage, and break into the system that way. So gaining access. How do we gain access? Well, it's really just a 3-step process. We're going to identify the target with the vulnerability, we're going to find a matching exploit, and then we're going to select a payload. Now, what do those 3 things really mean? Well, a vulnerability is a software coding error, so it's usually a software bug. It could also be a misconfiguration of the software as well that allows us to gain access to the target operating system. So, for instance, if you're running Microsoft Windows and you didn't apply the patch that came out last Tuesday, that is a known vulnerability. That can be something that I can attack. So that vulnerability just means that there is a hole that can be exploited. It doesn't mean that it was exploited. Now if we move on to an exploit is actually the method of delivery that the payload uses to accomplish the goal that it wants to do to get access. So to exploit it is actually to take that vulnerability and find a way to break into the system using that vulnerability. So an exploit is a method of delivery of a payload. And we're going to talk about payloads here in a second, but we want to deliver that payload to accomplish a specific goal. So when we have that vulnerability, it just means there's a hole there. But now how do we actually break in to get through that hole is the exploit itself. So if there was a software bug or a misconfiguration out there that was identified, that's the vulnerability. Now if we reverse engineer that and find a way that we can exploit that, that's where that exploit and that exploitation can occur. Now when we get into payloads, this is the effect. A payload is the effect caused by a virus or other malicious code that we want something to happen. So when we have a vulnerability, that's the hole, we have the exploit, the method, we then do the thing, which is the payload. So the payload is the actual code that's going to be run once the exploit occurs. So if we think about it like a house, for instance, just because you left the front door open doesn't mean the bad guy is going to break in. But if the bad guy finds that you left the front door open and he turns the handle, that's the exploit, that allows him to open the door. But he hasn't really done anything yet. Now once he steps through that door and grabs your TV and walks off, that was the payload, the theft of the TV. So those are how we have that vulnerability, that exploit, and that payload, and how they relate to each other. Now, as we go into our next couple of lectures, we're going to go into a deeper dive here. We're going to go into the lab environment, and we're going to walk through how a buffer overflow occurs, what a buffer overflow is, why it occurs, and how we can use that to our advantage. We're also going to talk about different payloads. We're going to talk about shellcode. We're going to talk about bind and reverse shellcode. And we're also going to go into talking about Meterpreter, which is a specific type of shellcode that we use inside the Metasploit environment, the Metasploit framework that we're using as our attack platform. So as we keep going through this, we're going to go through this gaining access phase. We're going to dive in just a little bit deeper into each of these areas. But again, the gaining access is just a big concept of finding a vulnerability, exploiting that vulnerability, and delivering and executing a payload.